The storm came without warning, the way the worst things always did, rolling across the Kansas plains in 1874 like a black curtain being drawn shut across the whole of the sky. And Augusta Kendrick was alone in the middle of it with a broken wagon wheel, a dead horse, and nothing but the howling dark ahead of her. She had been traveling the Kishom Trail adjacent roads since before sunrise, pushing her small covered wagon westward toward Abilene with a stubbornness that most people who knew her would have called characteristic, and most strangers would have called reckless. Augusta Kendrick had never been particularly interested in what strangers thought of her. She was 26 years old, broad-shouldered for a woman, with dark brown hair that had a tendency to curl at the temples when the humidity climbed, and green eyes that her late father had always said could see through a lie the way sunlight moved through creek water. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived things she was not prepared to talk about. She had left her home in Missouri 3 weeks prior, carrying what remained of her life in that battered wagon. Her father, Thomas Kendrick, had passed in the spring from a fever that moved fast and showed no mercy. The farm had gone to debts she did not know existed until the lawyers arrived with their papers and their carefully arranged expressions of sympathy. She had packed what she could. The rest was gone. A cousin in Abilene, a woman named Ruth who had married a merchant and seemed to be doing reasonably well, had written to Augusta in February and said that if things ever got hard, she should come west and they would figure something out together. Things had gotten hard, and so Augusta had come west. The rain began as a drizzle somewhere around midday, and then built itself into something furious by late afternoon. The mare, a reliable bay named Clover who had served the Kendrick family for 7 years, had spooked at a thunderclap so violent it seemed to shake the earth itself, stumbled into a rut, and broken her foreleg in the fall. Augusta had done what had to be done with the pistol she kept under the wagon seat. She had not cried. She had sat with Clover for a few minutes with her hand on the horse's neck, and then she had stood and looked around her at the treeless expanse of the Kansas grasslands, water sheeting sideways in the wind, and she had thought, in a remarkably calm internal voice, that she was in serious trouble. The temperature was dropping. She had flint and steel in the wagon but no dry tinder, because the canvas covering had torn 3 days ago in a lesser wind, and she had not been able to find anything along the road to replace it properly. Everything inside was damp or outright soaked. She could feel the cold beginning to work its way through her wool coat as the rain transitioned from summer rain to something colder and meaner. She was pulling whatever blankets she could salvage from the wagon when she heard the sound. It was faint against the storm, but it was unmistakable to anyone who had grown up on the prairie. The sound of a horse moving at a canter, coming from the east, coming toward her. She stood straight, one hand resting near the pistol at her hip, and watched the darkness. The rider materialized out of the rain the way figures sometimes do in bad weather, first as a shape and then as a solid presence, a large man on a tall sorrel horse, wearing a canvas duster that was dark with water, his hat pulled low against the wind. He pulled up when he saw her wagon, brought his horse to a stop about 20 yards out, and called across the distance, "You all right out there?" His voice carried well in the wind, a low voice, steady and unhurried. "My horse is down," Augusta called back. "Broken leg, I had to put her down. Wheel is cracked besides. I am managing." There was a pause in which the man seemed to assess the situation with patience. "You mind if I come closer? I am not a threat to you." Augusta kept her hand where it was. "Come ahead slowly." He did. He walked the sorrel in at a measured pace and stopped when he was close enough that she could see his face beneath the hat brim. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two more, with a lean, angular face that was sun-browned and steady, a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble, and eyes that were the particular shade of gray that seems almost silver in low light. He had big hands, the kind that came from years of rope and leather, and despite his considerable height in the saddle he sat relaxed, like a man comfortable in his own body. He looked at the dead mare. He looked at the cracked wheel. He looked at Augusta standing in the driving rain with her hat streaming water and her coat soaked through, and his expression held no condescension, only the clear-eyed reading of a problem that needed solving. "Stephen Fletcher," he said. "Out of the Rocking H Ranch east of Ellsworth." "Augusta Kendrick," she said. "Out of Missouri headed to Abilene." He nodded slowly. "That is still a fair distance in good weather." He looked at the sky. "This storm is not done by half. There is a line shack about a mile northwest, belongs to the Rocking H spread. It is not much, but it has 4 walls and a roof, and there is a stove inside." She looked at him steadily. "A line shack?" "Yes, ma'am. I am not suggesting anything improper. I am suggesting you do not freeze to death on the Kansas plain tonight, which is what will happen if the temperature keeps dropping like it has been." Augusta Kendrick prided herself on reading people, and she read this one now with everything she had. He sat easy in the saddle. His eyes met hers without deflection. There was something in his manner that suggested he was telling her the plain truth and found no particular drama in the fact of it. "All right," she said. "I need to take what I can from the wagon. Tell me what is important and I will help you carry it." They worked together for 20 minutes in the rain, pulling out what mattered most: her father's Bible, her sewing kit, a small wooden box that held her correspondence and documents, what dry food remained, 2 blankets that were less wet than the others. Stephen Fletcher did not ask questions about what she was carrying or why. He tied the bundles to his saddle with practiced efficiency, and then helped Augusta up onto the sorrel behind him with the matter-of-fact courtesy of a man who understood practicality. He was very warm, even through the wet canvas of his duster. She noticed it and said nothing. The line shack was exactly as he had described it. 4 rough-hewn board walls, a sound roof, a small iron stove with a flue pipe going through the ceiling, a stack of firewood against the south wall that was bone dry, a narrow cot in the corner with a single wool blanket, a table, 2 chairs, a lantern with enough oil remaining, and a shelf with some tins of beans and salt pork that had probably been left by ranch hands earlier in the season. It smelled of cedar and old smoke, and it was the most welcome sight Augusta had seen in weeks. Stephen Fletcher unsaddled the sorrel and put her in the small lean-to stable attached to the shack's back wall. Augusta stood in the doorway of the shack and watched the storm move across the sky with a fury that had real intention behind it now, lightning splitting the dark in long white branches. She felt the cold in her bones and turned to face the interior and the stove. She found kindling in a wooden box beside the wood stack, dry and ready to use. She found what appeared to be old newspaper in another corner. But when she checked her coat pockets for the flint and steel she kept there, she found only the flint. The steel had been in the wagon's small toolbox, which she had not thought to check. She searched all her pockets twice and then accepted the situation with a quiet exhalation. Stephen Fletcher came through the door pulling off his hat and shaking water from it. He looked at her standing by the unlit stove, and she told him directly, "I have lost my fire-starting steel. It was in the wagon. I have the flint, but that alone is not enough." He reached into the inside breast pocket of his duster and came out with a small tin matchbox. He opened it and held it toward the lantern he had already lit with what had apparently been his last working match from his shirt pocket. There was a single match remaining in the tin. She looked at it. 1 match. Outside, the storm was trying to tear the world apart. "That should be enough to start the kindling if we do it carefully," she said. He held the tin toward her without hesitation. "Take it. That is your last match. I can see that. What will you use to light anything once I have it?" He looked at her then with those gray eyes, and something moved across his face that was quieter and more serious than she expected, something that was not quite a smile but carried all the warmth one would have. He said, "I found my warmth." Augusta Kendrick stood still for a single long moment, the noise of the storm filling the world around them, the lantern light moving in a small draft from the door. She was not a woman who was easily rendered speechless. She found herself speechless. Then she turned to the stove and built a fire with the care of someone who understood that this one match was the only one they had. She got the fire started on the first try, the kindling catching and building into something real and true, the stove beginning to glow with amber warmth. She added split wood carefully, and the stove ticked and expanded, and the heat reached toward them both. Stephen Fletcher had taken off his duster and draped it over one of the chairs to dry. His flannel shirt was damp at the shoulders, but he seemed unbothered by it. He opened 2 tins of beans with the small knife he wore on his belt and set them on top of the stove to warm. Augusta peeled off her wet coat and her outer wool layer and hung them on the wall hooks near the door. She was left in a plain cotton shirtwaist and her riding skirt, her hair coming loose from its pins and curling at her temples from the damp. She sat in one of the chairs close to the stove and let the heat begin its work on bones that had been cold for what felt like days. They ate beans from the tin with 2 bent spoons from a small drawer in the table, and outside the storm raged and the lantern burned and the stove crackled with the particular intimacy of shared shelter. "What takes you to Abilene?" he asked, not intrusively, just conversationally. She told him. The death of her father, the farm and the debts, the cousin Ruth and the merchant husband. She told it plainly without self-pity, which he seemed to appreciate, listening without interjecting with false comfort. "I am sorry about your father," he said when she was done. He meant it. She could hear that he meant it. "What takes you along this road in a storm?" she asked. He told her he had been checking the south fence line for the rocking H. There had been reports of fence cutting, which was a running problem in Kansas in those years, as the cattle business, and the farming settlements pulled against each other like 2 dogs on opposite ends of the same rope. He was the ranch foreman, had been for 3 years. He had come to Kansas from Texas, where he had worked several different outfits up the Kishom Trail and eventually decided that the Kansas range suited him better than a trail drive that never ended. "Do you have family here?" she asked. "No family anywhere in particular," he said without self-pity of his own. "My parents died when I was young, fever same as your father." "Were they in Texas?" "Arkansas, originally. I came up to Texas with an uncle who ran cattle. He died of a snake bite when I was 17. After that I just worked." "That is a long time of working." He almost smiled. "It passes." The storm kept on for hours. Augusta wrapped herself in one of the blankets she had brought from the wagon, and Stephen Fletcher dozed in his chair with his arms folded and his chin near his chest, looking so utterly comfortable doing it that she wondered how many times in his life he had slept in a chair in a lined shack waiting for a storm to pass. Probably many times. He was that kind of man, the kind that storms found and found capable of waiting them out. She watched him sleep for a while in a way that she knew was not entirely appropriate and did not particularly care. He had a strong, honest face. Even asleep it suggested trustworthiness, and Augusta Kendrick, whose entire life had recently demonstrated that the world was far less trustworthy than she had assumed, found herself unusually grateful for a trustworthy face. Sometime deep in the night the storm finally broke. She heard the rain decrease to a patter and then stop altogether, and through the one small window of the shack she could see stars beginning to appear, enormous and cold and brilliant, the way Kansas stars always were after rain had cleaned the air. She woke him by saying his name quietly. He came awake without the disorientation that plagued some people, his gray eyes open and immediately clear. "Storm is done," she said. He looked at the window. "Good," he said, and then looked at her in the star-white light coming through the glass. "Did you sleep at all?" "Some. Enough." They sat in comfortable silence for a little while, the stove having burned down to embers now, the warmth still resident in the small room. Augusta became aware that this was one of the more peculiar moments of her adult life, sitting in a lined shack in the Kansas dark with a stranger who was somehow not quite a stranger anymore, a man who had given her his last match and said 4 words that had rattled around in her chest all night and refused to stop. "That was a remarkable thing to say," she told him. He looked at her directly. Which thing? You know which thing. He was quiet for a moment, then it was the truth. She held his gaze. You have known me for perhaps 5 hours. That is true, he said, without backing away from any part of what he had said. The dawn came pale gold and clean-washed over the Kansas plain, the grass glittering with last night's rain, the sky above them the particular blue that follows a storm and seems cleaner than any other blue in nature. Stephen Fletcher's sorrel mare stood in the linta, looking entirely self-satisfied. Augusta's belongings were still bundled on the saddle from the night before. He walked back out to her wagon with her in the morning light to assess things properly. The wheel was cracked through at the hub, unfixable on the road. The wagon itself was sound. Clover lay where she had fallen. Augusta looked at the mare for a moment and then looked away. I can help you get to Abilene, Stephen said. The Rocking H keeps a team at the Ellsworth station. I can arrange for you to borrow a horse if you have got anything to put up against it. She thought about what she had. I have $20 in coin. I was keeping it for Ruth's husband in case he needed recompense for taking me in. Keep your money, Stephen said flatly. I will vouch for you with the station manager. You can pay the horse fee when you are settled and have the means. She looked at him. Why? Because you need a horse and I can arrange one and there is no good reason not to. He said it without flourish, as though the kindness required no justification. It was, Augusta thought, the most straightforwardly decent thing anyone had done for her in months. They rode double on the sorrel to Ellsworth, which was a larger, louder, dustier affair than Augusta had expected, full of cattle pens and saloons, and the constant percussion of hammers as new buildings went up along the main street. Ellsworth in 1874 was at the peak of its cattle drive years, when the Kishom Trail drove Texas longhorns north by the thousands, and the town trembled with commerce and occasional violence. Augusta took it all in from behind Stephen Fletcher's shoulder as the sorrel moved down the main street. He arranged the horse at the livery station, as he had said he would, speaking to the station manager with a quiet authority that got the business done without fuss, signing papers and shaking hands, while Augusta stood nearby with her bundled belongings and watched the town go about its extravagant morning business. She had a small roan mare within the hour, a compact and agreeable animal that the station manager called Pepper, and that seemed to live up to the name by having strong opinions about which direction she preferred to walk. Augusta handled her without difficulty, having grown up on horseback. Stephen Fletcher walked her and Pepper to the Abilene Road at the edge of town. He stood holding his sorrel's reins, looking at her in the full morning light, and Augusta had the very clear sensation that they were both standing at a threshold of some kind, one of those moments that hinge between what has been and what might come after. I want to thank you, she said, properly. You likely saved my life last night. The shack saved your life, I just knew where it was. And the match. He met her eyes. The light was full on his face and there was nothing evasive in it, nothing performed, just a man looking at a woman with the unguarded honesty of someone who did not know how to be otherwise. The match was easy to give, he said. She gathered Pepper's reins. I hope our paths cross again, Mr. Fletcher. I expect they will, Miss Kendrick. He said it with a quiet certainty that was not arrogance, only conviction. She rode for Abilene. Abilene was 40 miles farther west, and she made it in a day and a half, camping one night along the road and reaching her cousin's house by mid-afternoon of the following day. Ruth was exactly as her letters had promised, a compact, energetic woman of 30 with her husband's prosperity worn easily about her, not ostentatiously, but in the simple practical comfort of a house with real glass windows and a cookstove that was not broken. Her husband was Henry Malone, a dry goods merchant of 40 who was steady and mild, and clearly devoted to Ruth in the unremarkable daily way of long marriages. Ruth embraced Augusta in the yard before she was even properly dismounted, exclaiming over the torn canvas, the borrowed horse, the state of Augusta's coat, and then pulling her inside to tell her everything that had happened and to be fed properly. Augusta told her story over supper. Ruth listened with wide eyes and Henry made occasional sounds of sympathetic concern. When Augusta described the storm and the line shack and Stephen Fletcher, Ruth became very still in a way that suggested she was filing information carefully. "A ranch foreman," Ruth said, "for the Rocking H east of Ellsworth. And he gave you his last match." "He did." Ruth looked at Henry with an expression that said many things without saying any of them aloud. Henry had the good sense to focus on his stew. "He sounds like a particular kind of man," Ruth said to Augusta. "He is," Augusta said. "I do not know entirely what kind yet." She settled into Ruth and Henry's spare room, a clean and decent space with a real iron bed frame and curtains on the window. She helped Ruth with the housekeeping in the mornings and spent her afternoons learning the town. Abilene was in a period of transition in 1874. The cattle trade that had made it famous beginning to shift westward toward Wichita and Ellsworth as the farmers moved in, and the long drives rerouted. But it was still a lively and complex place with enough commerce to support a woman willing to work. Augusta found work within 2 weeks at a dressmaker's shop run by a widow named Mrs. Clarissa Holt, who was 53 years old and sharp as a tack, and who hired Augusta after a 10-minute conversation in which Augusta demonstrated that she could sew a straight seam and did not frighten easily. Mrs. Holt's shop served the wives of merchants and ranchers and the occasional well-heeled traveler, and the work was steady and skilled and paid decently. Augusta was good at it. Her mother had taught her sewing as a matter of practical necessity, and Augusta had always been neat-handed. She was 3 weeks in Abilene when she saw Stephen Fletcher again. She had not been looking for him, which she later thought was probably the right way for such things to go. She was crossing the main street on a Tuesday morning, heading toward Mrs. Holt's shop with a basket of fabric on her arm, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Miss Kendrick," she turned. He was standing outside the post office, a letter in one hand and his hat in the other, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has just seen something he had been hoping to see but had not allowed himself to expect. "Mr. Fletcher," she said. They stood on the Abilene Main Street in the October sunshine looking at each other for a moment that stretched pleasantly. "What brings you to Abilene?" she asked. "Supply run for the ranch. I come in once a month or so." He glanced at her basket. "You are working at Mrs. Holt's dressmaking shop 3 weeks now. Are you well settled? Better every day?" She paused. "You?" "Well enough." He turned his hat once in his hand. "I was thinking of getting my dinner at the hotel dining room. They do a reasonable beef plate on Tuesdays. Would you do me the honor of joining me if you are not expected at your work just yet?" She had 40 minutes before Mrs. Holt expected her. She told him so, and yes, she would join him. They sat across from each other in the hotel dining room at a table by the window that looked out onto the street, and they talked for 40 minutes, and then for 40 minutes beyond that, after Augusta sent a boy with a message to Mrs. Holt, explaining she would be a short while delayed. Mrs. Holt had replied with a note that said simply that she would expect the extra seam allowance handled with care, and that Augusta should take whatever time she needed, which Augusta suspected meant Mrs. Holt was wiser about certain things than she let on. They talked about his ranch work and about the fence-cutting troubles that had gotten worse since she had last seen him, about her work at the dressmakers and the particular challenge of fitting customers who were not built like the fashion plates suggested women ought to be, about Abilene and Ellsworth, and the way the cattle trade was shifting, and what it meant for the towns built around it. They talked about her father and about his years on the trail. They talked about books, because she had mentioned her father's library and he had mentioned, with the slight self-consciousness of a man who had educated himself without much help, that he had read widely on his own time. He had read Dickens and liked it, which surprised her and then did not surprise her at all. When she finally had to go, she stood and he stood, and they faced each other in the dining room doorway with the kind of awkward, charged awareness that belongs to two people who have just had a very good conversation and are not sure what the protocol requires of them next. "I will be in Abilene again next month," he said. "I will be at Mrs. Holt's shop most days," she said. "I will find you." "Yes," she said, with more certainty than she had perhaps intended to express, and then she walked back to the shop with the mid-morning sun on her shoulders and the definite, unargumentable feeling that something important was beginning. He came the following month as he had said he would, and this time they walked along the river path south of town and talked until the afternoon light went long and golden. He was easy to walk with. He matched his stride to hers without making a point of it. She noticed that he positioned himself on the outside of the path, between her and the road, and that he did it without thinking about it, as a habit of courtesy rather than performance. She told him things she had not told anyone in Abilene, about what it had been like to watch her father die, about signing the papers that transferred the farm to the creditors, about the particular loneliness of moving through the world without family anchor. He listened in the complete way that some people do, where you can feel the attention rather than just observing the outward signs of it. "Do you think about going back to Missouri?" he asked. "There is nothing to go back to," she said. "Not bitterly, just factually. That is one way of looking at it," he said. "Is there another? Sometimes when there is nothing to go back to, it means you are free to go forward." She looked at him. The river caught the afternoon light and threw it into silver moving shapes across the water's surface. An egret stood in the shallows, motionless and dignified. "You are a more philosophical man than you let on," she said. "I try not to let on too much," he said, and she laughed, which was apparently what he had been working toward, because something eased in his expression when she did. He asked if he could write to her between visits, if that was acceptable to her. She told him it was more than acceptable. He wrote the first letter 2 weeks after he left, and it arrived on a Thursday, a single page in a careful hand that suggested a man who had worked hard to make his penmanship something respectable. The letter was about the ranch and about a particularly difficult calf that had been born breech during the first cold snap of the season, and about a book he had found in Ellsworth's one small bookshop, a collection of poems by Walt Whitman that he had been reading in the evenings, and which he recommended to her with the earnest enthusiasm of someone who has found something good and wants to share it. She wrote back that same evening, 4 pages. The correspondence continued through November and into December. His letters were not flowery. They did not overflow with declarations, but they were warm and substantive and full of the particular details that told her he thought about her between writing, that he noticed things and filed them away to tell her. A hawk he had seen above the south pasture, sitting perfectly still on a fence post for 20 minutes in the cold air. The way the rocking-age hands played cards by firelight on Sunday evenings, the various personalities at the table, the old cook named Burl who cheated so consistently, and so obviously that everyone had long since decided it was charitable to let him win occasionally. She found herself reading his letters more than once, and on more than one occasion had to remind herself to put them away before Ruth saw her reading them for the 3rd time, and acquired even more material for the knowing look she had already developed. Ruth had, in the weeks since Augusta's arrival, constructed a fairly detailed picture of Stephen Fletcher from the fragments Augusta let fall in conversation, and she reviewed this picture with the satisfaction of someone assembling a puzzle that was coming together nicely. "You are falling in love with that man," Ruth told Augusta on a December evening when they were sitting together by the parlor fire. "I have had dinner with him twice and walked along a river," Augusta said. "And how many letters?" Augusta said nothing. "That is what I thought," Ruth said with great contentment. "Stephen came to Abilene in December just before Christmas. He brought her a gift which surprised her because they had not discussed gifts. It was a small, beautiful copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, bound in dark green cloth, found in Ellsworth. Inside the front cover he had written in his careful hand only, for AK from SF with the date. She had been standing in Mrs. Holt's shop when he brought it in, and she held it with both hands and looked at it and then looked at him and found that the distance between them in that room felt excessive and unnecessary. Mrs. Holt, who was in the back and could certainly hear everything through the thin walls of her shop, managed to make a series of small sounds at appropriately timed intervals that suggested she was being very tactfully oblivious. "It is beautiful," Augusta said. "Thank you. I thought you might like it. Your father's library sounds like it had good taste." "It did." She ran her thumb over the cloth cover. "I did not get you anything. You were not supposed to. This was just something I wanted you to have." She looked at him over the book and he looked back, and the moment stretched between them with a kind of inevitability that Augusta had been circling for weeks and finally decided to simply walk into. "Are you free this evening?" she asked. "I am entirely free this evening." "Then come for supper. Ruth will not mind, and I would like you to meet her properly. And Henry." "I would like that very much," he said. Supper at Ruth and Henry's that evening was one of the better meals Augusta could remember. Not because of the food, though Ruth was an excellent cook and had produced a fine roasted chicken and apple pie, but because of the quality of the company and the particular light that the whole evening had. The lamplight and the warm kitchen and the conversation running easy between Stephen and Henry, who discovered a shared opinion about Kansas land management, that kept them engaged for the better part of an hour while Ruth and Augusta cleared the table. Ruth whispered to Augusta in the kitchen, "He looks at you the way Henry looked at me the first time he came to supper at my mother's house." "How did Henry look at you?" "Like you were the only thing in the room that made sense," Ruth said. Augusta did not say anything to that. She carried the pie in. After supper, Stephen and Augusta sat on the front porch of Ruth and Henry's house in the cold December air under a sky absolutely packed with stars, wrapped in separate quilts, and talked until Ruth came to the door at 11 o'clock and said in a tone that was firm but not unkind that she thought they had both better get some rest. Before he left, standing on the porch steps with his hat in his hands and the night around them both, Stephen Fletcher looked up at her where she stood on the porch above him and said, "Augusta." It was the first time he had used her name directly. She had noticed this, had noticed the careful formality of Mr. Fletcher and Miss Kendrick, had understood it as a form of respect. "Stephen," she said, "I think about you considerably more than is probably appropriate given the current state of things between us," he said. He said it steadily, the way he said everything, as though the truth did not require decoration. "What state would you like things to be in?" she asked. He held her gaze. "A better one if you are willing." "I am willing," she said. He nodded once, in the slow, definitive way of a man who has just had something important confirmed. He put his hat on. He looked at her one more time, the light from the window catching the silver in his gray eyes. "I will be back in 2 weeks," he said, "before New Year's." "I will be here," she said. He rode off into the cold night, and Augusta stood on the porch until she could no longer hear the sorrel's hoofbeats, and then she went inside to find Ruth standing in the parlor doorway with her arms folded and an expression of absolute satisfaction. "Not a word," Augusta told her. "Not a word," Ruth agreed and said, "I am so glad you came west." He came back in 2 weeks, exactly as he had said, arriving on the 29th of December on a morning that was bright and brittle cold, frost on every surface, his breath visible in the air. He came straight to Mrs. Holt's shop, and Augusta looked up from the hem she was working on, and there he was in the doorway, hat off, his face wind-burned and animated in a way that was slightly different from his usual measured calm. "I need to talk to you," he said. Mrs. Holt made a decisive and tactful retreat into the back of the shop. "What is it?" Augusta asked, setting down her work. He came in and stood across the worktable from her. He said, "There is a piece of land. 40 acres south of Ellsworth, about 7 miles along the creek. The owner is a man named Garfield who is moving his family east, going home to Ohio, had enough of Kansas. He is selling the land with the house and the outbuildings and 20 head of cattle and a pair of good draft horses. And the price is reasonable because he wants to sell fast, and he wants to sell to someone who will work it right." Augusta was watching him carefully. I have been saving for 3 years, Stephen continued. I have enough for the purchase and enough to run the operation through the first year if things go reasonably. The Rocking H land is good land and I know the territory. He paused. He was holding his hat in both hands and working the brim steadily without appearing to notice he was doing it. I could run it as a ranch if I had a partner. The word partner landed in the room with a weight that suggested it was carrying significant freight. What kind of partner? Augusta asked, her voice perfectly level. He looked at her directly. The kind that is also a wife. The shop was quiet. Outside, a wagon went by. The stove ticked. Augusta Kendrick had been proposed to once before, by a young man in Missouri named Edmund Farwell when she was 22, and she had turned him down with the certain knowledge that she did not feel anything for Edmund Farwell beyond amiable indifference. She had wondered, then, if she was perhaps too particular, too self-contained, too comfortable alone to feel the kind of thing that would make a marriage into something worth having. She did not feel amiable indifference toward Stephen Fletcher. She felt a great deal. "You are asking me to marry you," she said. "I am. Not in a manner I would call romantic, I understand that. I will do better if you want something more, Stephen." He stopped. "Yes," she said. "My answer is yes." He stood absolutely still for a moment. Then something opened in his face that she had not seen before, a warmth that had been there all along behind the quiet and the steadiness and the careful measured manner, surfacing now like light coming through parted clouds. He came around the worktable in 2 steps and took both her hands in his, and this was, for Stephen Fletcher, the equivalent of a man less self-contained collapsing to his knees. His hands were warm and very certain. "You are sure," he said. "I am almost never uncertain," she told him, "but on this particular matter I am about as certain as I have been about anything in my life." They were married in Abilene on the 14th of February, 1875, at the small Presbyterian church on the east end of town, with Ruth and Henry as witnesses, and Mrs. Holt in the front pew looking proud in a way that rather exceeded what might strictly be expected from an employer. The minister was a young man named Reverend Calloway, who seemed genuinely moved by the ceremony, possibly because the 2 people in front of him conducted it with a seriousness and attention that suggested they understood exactly what they were promising. Augusta wore a dress she had made herself, pale blue wool with cream lace at the collar and cuffs, and she had done her dark hair up in a way that let the curls at her temples do what they always wanted to do. She was the most beautiful thing Stephen Fletcher had ever seen in his life, and he told her so, quietly, when they stood together before the minister, and she squeezed his hand and told him he was not bad himself. After the ceremony there was a small supper at Ruth and Henry's house, and then Stephen and Augusta rode together to Ellsworth, and from there to the Garfield property, which was now the Fletcher property, in the deep winter twilight, the land around them silver and still, the farmhouse ahead with smoke rising from the chimney where a Rocking H hand had come ahead to start the stove and leave lanterns burning. Augusta stood in the yard and looked at the house and the outbuildings and the 40 acres of Kansas land stretching in every direction, pale and quiet under the winter sky. "It is good land," she said. "It is very good land," Stephen agreed, standing beside her. "It needs work." "Most worthwhile things do." She looked at him. He was watching her watch the land with that contained warmth in his face that she had come to understand was the particular expression he reserved for her and only her. "Well," she said, "I have never been afraid of work." "I know that," he said. "It is one of the reasons I married you." "Only one." "One of many," he said, and the way he looked at her when he said it made the Kansas winter feel considerably less cold. Spring came to the Fletcher property with a force that Augusta had not quite anticipated, the plains grass coming green and urgent, the creek running high and fast with snowmelt from far north, the sky opening up into that enormous blue that made a person feel both very small and very wonderfully alive. They had 40 acres and 20 head and 2 good horses, and a house that needed the roof chinked in 2 places, and a kitchen garden that Augusta planted from seeds she had been storing since Missouri. The work was constant and real, and often exhausting, and Augusta loved it with a sincerity that surprised even her. She had been a woman of indoor occupations in Missouri, her father's house and her needlework and her reading, but she had always had a physical restlessness that never quite found an outlet there. On the Fletcher property, she was up before dawn and busy until dark, and she felt, at the end of each day, a satisfaction so complete it was almost its own form of luxury. Stephen worked alongside her in the way of a man who had never considered the division of labor along gender lines to be particularly sensible when there was a real partner involved. She learned the cattle. He learned the garden. They divided the account book between them and discussed every expenditure at the kitchen table after supper with the deliberate partnership of two people who had each, in different ways, seen what happened when resources were not carefully managed. In the evenings they read. Stephen continued with Whitman, and Augusta went through the Shakespeare sonnets he had given her, and then moved on to a novel, and they sat on opposite sides of the fireplace with their separate books and their shared silence, which was one of the finest silences Augusta had ever inhabited. He had a habit of reading aloud when he came across something that struck him. He would look up from the page and read the passage without preamble, in the straightforward voice he brought to everything, and then go back to reading. She had adopted the same habit, and they had worked out a kind of wordless understanding about it. Neither of them expected a response unless one was offered. The reading aloud was simply a form of sharing, the way people pass food at a table. They had their first real argument in April over whether to buy a third horse for the plowing, which Augusta thought was an unnecessary expense, given that the two draft horses could handle the ground with proper rotation, and Stephen thought was a necessary investment against the possibility of one of the horses going lame at a critical moment. The argument lasted most of one evening, serious and genuine, neither of them giving ground easily, and ended with a compromise that involved a trial period with the two horses through the spring planting and a reassessment in June. The compromise, Augusta noticed, was arrived at without either of them raising a voice above normal conversation level, and this struck her as the best sign she had yet seen of the marriage's underlying health. In June the horses held and they did not buy the third one, and Stephen said, in the manner of a man who is conceding a practical point, "You were right about the horses." "I know," she said, not unkindly. He almost smiled. "You are remarkably comfortable being right." "I had a great deal of practice," she said. "I was right about a great many things my entire life, and no one particularly wanted to hear it." "I want to hear it," he said. "I know that too," she said, and the smile she gave him then was one she did not give to many people, wide and unguarded and full. Summer on the Kansas plain was another thing entirely from summer in Missouri, hotter and more violent, the storms arriving with theatrical suddenness, the heat building through July into something that sat on the land like a physical weight. Augusta learned to work in the early morning and early evening, and rest through the worst of the afternoon heat, which Stephen had been doing for years, and which turned out to make extraordinary practical sense. They hired a hand for the summer season, a young man of 21 named Thomas Reardon, who had come up from Texas on a drive and missed the drive back south and found himself in Kansas with no particular plan. He was a good worker, honest and willing, and he ate supper with them 3 evenings a week, a habit that had started practically and become social because Thomas Reardon turned out to be a genuinely entertaining conversationalist with a talent for frontier stories that he told in a deadpan style that made them funnier. Ruth and Henry came to visit in July, making the ride from Abilene in 2 days, and Ruth walked the property with Augusta on the morning of the first day, looking at the kitchen garden and the cattle pasture and the repaired fence line and the creek with her arms folded and a very complete expression on her face. "You look different," Ruth told Augusta. "Different how?" "Like a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be." Augusta looked out over the green Kansas land, the cattle moving slow and contented in the distance, the creek catching light through the willows, the house solid and real behind them. "I feel like that," she admitted. Ruth put her arm through Augusta's and they walked back toward the house. "Your father would have liked him," Ruth said. Augusta considered this. "Yes," she said, "I think he would have." The autumn brought its own work, the harvest of the kitchen garden, the preparations for winter, the careful management of the cattle through the colder months. Stephen taught her how to read the weather signs that the plains gave off before a storm, the particular color of the southwestern sky, the behavior of the meadowlarks, the way the air pressure dropped, and the cattle moved toward shelter hours before any human could sense a change. She was a quick learner, and he was a patient teacher, and the knowledge transferred between them with the ease of things shared between people who are genuinely paying attention to each other. On an October evening, the same month that Augusta had first arrived in Kansas the year before, they sat on the porch in the cooling air with their coffee and watched the sunset perform its extravagant western business across the whole of the sky, going from gold to orange to a deep impossible red before fading to purple and then star-dark. "Do you remember this time last year?" she asked. "Very clearly," he said. "I was soaked through and frozen and furious at that wheel." "You did not seem furious. You seemed capable." "I was both," she said. He looked at the sky. "I saw you standing in the rain beside that wagon and I thought, that woman is going to manage this no matter what, and I thought I would very much like to know that woman." She turned to look at him in the last of the light. And I was right about both things," he said. She reached over and put her hand on his where it rested on his knee. He turned his hand over and held hers, which was the kind of gesture that requires no commentary. By the winter of 1875 into 1876, the Fletcher property was running well and showing genuine profit, modest but real. The cattle had done well at market. The garden had been productive enough that Augusta had put up preserves enough to last through winter and have some for trade. And Stephen had negotiated a favorable lease arrangement with a neighboring farmer for the use of an additional pasture, which effectively expanded their grazing capacity without the cost of buying land outright. Augusta managed the accounts and did it well, her needle-sharp mathematical mind finding the work congenial, and she also continued doing some dressmaking work, taking in orders from the wives of the Ellsworth ranchers and one or two ladies from town who had heard through Mrs. Holt that there was a seamstress in the county who could fit a difficult silhouette with uncommon skill. She had learned in this time a great deal about the landscape of injustice that the Kansas plains contained in plain sight, the way the Kaw and Osage peoples who had lived on this land for generations had been pushed further and further out as the settlements moved in, the treaties broken so routinely that the breaking seemed to be the actual policy dressed in legal language. She talked about this with Stephen, who had his own complicated feelings about it, having worked beside native cowboys on trail drives, and having seen the full range of treatment that ranged from barely tolerable to outright brutal. They could not solve it, standing in their kitchen in Ellsworth County in 1876, but Augusta felt strongly that refusing to see it would be its own form of wrongness, and Stephen agreed with her. She also saw what happened to the women in the territory who had no money of their own, no skill that translated to wages, no cousin with a spare room and a decent husband, and she felt the particular gratitude of someone who understood clearly that her own security rested on a sequence of very specific pieces of luck. A father who taught her to sew and to manage figures, a cousin who had written at the right moment, a stormy night on a Kansas road that had produced, of all things, a man with one last match and something true to say. She thought about that moment often. She had thought about it the morning after, and she had thought about it through all the months of correspondence and dinner and courtship and marriage, and the long, hard, beautiful work of building a life together. And she had never quite lost the quality of wonder it contained, the particular rightness of his answer, the weight it carried as she had come to know him better and understand how completely he had meant it. She told him so one February evening, the 14th, their first anniversary, over a supper she had cooked with particular care, the kitchen smelling of roasted meat, and the pie she had made with preserved cherries from the summer. "When you said that," she told him, "I did not entirely understand it. I thought it was charming. I thought you were perhaps a little more at ease with words than I had anticipated from a ranch foreman in a canvas duster." He laughed at that, a rare and very good sound. "But what I understand now," she continued, leaning slightly forward, the candle between them catching in her green eyes, "is that you were not being charming at all. You were being literal." "I was," he said. "You had known me for 5 hours. I had. Some things are apparent in 5 hours. I was soaking wet and bad-tempered about the wheel. You were not bad-tempered. You were competent and clear-headed and genuine," he said. "Those things were apparent in about 5 minutes." She looked at him across the small kitchen table with its candle and its anniversary supper and the first winter of their marriage visible through the window, the moonlight on the frost-silver land. "I am very glad you were on that road," she said. "I am very glad of the storm," he said. "Without the storm you would not have needed the shack. I might have frozen. I would not have let that happen. You could not have known you would find me." "No," he said, "but I think I would have been on that road regardless, and I think I would have found you regardless, because I am quite certain that the universe was not going to let us miss each other." Augusta Kendrick, who was not given to sentimentality as a general habit, felt something move through her chest that was warm and sure and permanent, the kind of feeling that belongs to things that have put down real roots. "You are," she told him, "considerably more romantic than anyone looking at you would suspect." "It is a private quality," he agreed. She smiled. "I am glad it is mine." He reached across the table and touched her face, his thumb at her cheekbone, and she leaned into it the way something finding its direction leans into a compass reading. They had their first child in December of 1876. A boy, born on a cold, clear night with the assistance of the Ellsworth doctor and Ruth, who had arrived 3 days before the due date with her sleeves already rolled up. They named him Thomas William Fletcher, Thomas for Augusta's father and William for no particular reason, except that it sounded right when attached to Thomas and Fletcher, which was the way the best names sometimes work. Thomas William Fletcher was a substantial and loud baby, who from the very first day showed signs of possessing his mother's opinion about everything and his father's determination to see it through, which Augusta said was either a magnificent combination or a deeply exhausting one, possibly both. Stephen held his son on the evening of the second day, sitting in the rocking chair by the fire with the baby wrapped in the quilt Ruth had made as a gift, and his face was something Augusta stored away with the most important things she had ever seen, the kind of expression on a person's face that you know you are going to carry with you the rest of your life. It was wonder and responsibility and love all at once, thoroughly unguarded, the most open she had ever seen him. "Well," Stephen said to the baby, in the quiet voice he used for things that mattered, "here you are." Thomas William made a small sound of general agreement. Ruth, who was still in the kitchen and could hear all of this perfectly well, caught Augusta's eye and smiled with such completeness that no words were needed or offered. The years after Thomas were full and good, marked by the particular texture of life lived close to land and weather, and the slow accumulation of small joys. The rocking H, where Stephen had worked as foreman, changed ownership in 1877 when the original owner retired east, and the new owner proved difficult, the kind of man who treated his hands poorly and made decisions based on short-term profit without regard for the land's capacity. Stephen had quietly decided, over the previous 2 years, that being his own man on his own 40 acres was the better life, and the events at the rocking H confirmed it. He expanded the Fletcher operation in 1878, purchasing an adjacent 15 acres when the farmer who held it decided against a third Kansas winter, and they added a proper hay barn that summer with help from 3 neighboring ranchers, one of whom was a Cherokee man named James Sixskiller, who had his own 40 acres south of the creek, and who became over the following years one of the genuine friends of their household. A quiet man of 40 with a dry wit and extraordinary knowledge of the land's seasonal moods. James and his wife Clara brought their children over on Sunday afternoons sometimes, and the kitchen would fill up with noise and coffee and the particular comfortable chaos of real friendship. Augusta continued her dressmaking through all of it, the additional income useful and the work itself a pleasure, her skill growing into something that people rode distances to access. She had fitted 3 wedding dresses in 1877 and 5 in 1878, and eventually, by 1880, had established what could properly be called a small dressmaking business, with regular clients across 2 counties. She worked from home, her sewing room set up in what had been a storage room off the kitchen, bright with the south-facing window she had specifically requested when they made that part of the house over. Their second child came in 1879. Another boy, whom they named Robert James Fletcher, Robert for no ancestor but simply because both Stephen and Augusta found it sturdy and honest, and James for their friend James Sixkiller, who received this news with visible emotion that he managed in his customary quiet manner, and then went and sat on the porch for a few minutes alone while Stephen pretended not to notice. Robert James was smaller at birth than Thomas had been, and darker, with the deep brown eyes that ran in the Kendrick family. He was a quieter child from the beginning, careful and observant, with a quality of stillness that occasionally unnerved people who did not know that stillness can coexist with great internal activity. Augusta recognized it immediately because she had had it herself as a child, and she understood it required no correction. Thomas, at 3, received his baby brother with the complex mixture of delight and territorial suspicion that eldest children tend to produce, and worked out his position over the following months with the pragmatic approach of someone who has decided that if you cannot remove the complication, you might as well lead it, which was something of a Fletcher family trait. Stephen watched his sons navigate each other with the patient attention he brought to all living things that were trying to figure themselves out, and found in the process a satisfaction so profound it occasionally stopped him mid-task just to hold for a moment. There was a late spring storm in 1880 that hit the Fletcher property hard, taking half the barn roof off and damaging the south fence line, and knocking down 2 of the big cottonwoods along the creek. They were 2 days clearing and repairing, Augusta working beside Stephen in boots and work clothes with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, Thomas at 7 old enough to help with the lighter work, Robert at 1 being minded by James Sixkiller's wife Clara at their house south of the creek. On the second evening, when most of the urgent work was done and they were sitting on the porch steps in the aftermath, the sky that particular exhausted blue that comes after wind has pushed everything clean, Augusta said, "I thought about that first storm." Stephen looked at her. "Every storm since then I think about that one," she said. "It is strange what a storm can change." "Or reveal," he said. "Or reveal," she agreed. He looked at the property around them. The repaired barn, the fence line, the creek willows still dripping, their house solid on its foundation with the lamplight visible through the kitchen window. "I was thinking," he said, turning his hat over in his hands, the old habit she had long since catalogued, "that we should put a proper porch across the whole front of the house. This step is not sufficient for 2 people sitting on it." She looked down at the narrow step on which they were both, in fact, sitting quite close together because the step demanded it. "Is that a criticism of the step?" she said. "No," he said. "I have always been fond of the step." She rested her head briefly against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the insufficient step in the evening after the storm with their Kansas land spread out around them, their sons somewhere in the house, their life built and real and very much their own. The porch was built the following summer, wide enough for 2 rocking chairs side by side, which was what Augusta had specified, because she had been thinking about those evenings in Missouri watching her parents on their porch in their 2 chairs, and she had thought, Even then, at 10 years old, that was the kind of life she wanted. The quiet kind that holds room for two people side by side. Stephen built it himself, with Thomas helping and Robert supervising from a safe distance with great seriousness. And when it was done, Augusta stood back and looked at the house with its new wide porch, and felt the particular satisfaction of a life being assembled piece by piece into something that would last. Ruth and Henry came for Christmas of 1880, their third visit to the Fletcher property, and Henry had, during the years of these visits, developed a thorough appreciation of Stephen's management of the land that expressed itself in long conversations over the supper table about Kansas agriculture and market prices, and the future of the territory. Ruth had developed a thorough appreciation of Augusta's home and the quality of contentment in it, which she expressed by arriving with generous gifts for the boys and several strong opinions about the kitchen gardens organization that Augusta received with the affectionate patience of a woman who understood that some cousins have views about gardens. James and Clara Sixkiller came on Christmas afternoon, their 4 children in various stages of festivity, and the Fletcher house was full to a degree that required the chairs to be redistributed creatively, and the 2 older boys of both families to eat at a separate smaller table that Thomas regarded as an insult to his dignity and Robert regarded as an adventure. Augusta looked around the table at everyone in it, the candlelight over all of it, the fire doing its warm work in the corner, Stephen at the other end of the table in the easy authority of a man entirely at home, and she thought about a woman standing in a rainstorm on the Kansas plain with a broken wheel and a dead horse and nothing ahead but the dark. She thought about a last match. She thought about warmth. The winter of 1881 was the coldest they had yet seen on the Kansas plains, the kind of cold that arrives in early November and does not lift until late March, that freezes the creek solid for weeks at a stretch, and requires the cattle to be moved to the near pasture, where the hay barn's windbreak gave them protection. Stephen and Thomas, who was 8 now and doing genuine work alongside his father, spent the worst weeks in constant management of the herd, moving animals, breaking ice on the water trough, distributing hay in the bitter early mornings. Augusta kept the house and fed the workers and managed the accounts with the winter's particular indoor focus, and in the evenings she taught Thomas his letters and arithmetic at the kitchen table while Robert drew in his sketchbook, a habit he had developed at 4 years old and pursued with the devotion of a calling. Robert James Fletcher, it emerged over these years, had an extraordinary facility for drawing. He drew the horses and the cattle and the creek willow and the prairie birds and his brother and his parents and James Sixkiller's dogs and the barn's interior and the sky in all its Kansas varieties, with a precision and feeling that made the adults in his life exchange the significant looks of people witnessing a gift. Augusta encouraged it without pressuring it, keeping him supplied with paper and charcoal, and later, when she could afford it from the dressmaking income, a small set of watercolors that a supply trader brought through from Kansas City. Thomas, for his part, was developing into the outdoors creature his father had always been, with a feel for the land and the animals that expressed itself in the patient, knowledgeable way he moved among the cattle and the horses. At 8, he could already read the weather signs his father had taught him, and he had begun learning the horse management with an aptitude that made the horse itself cooperative in a way they are not always cooperative with beginners. Stephen watched his sons become themselves with the same profound interest he brought to the land, as though both were living things that rewarded careful attention and patient observation, and the willingness to be surprised. Augusta continued to surprise him. This was, he would have told you if you asked him directly, one of the defining conditions of their life together. After 6 years of marriage, he still found her remarkable with a regularity that showed no sign of diminishing. The sharpness of her mind, the physical competence she had developed on the property, the quality of her friendship which was direct and genuine and unsentimentally kind. The way she ran the household with the precise efficiency of someone who understood that a household was an economic unit as much as a domestic one, and managed it accordingly, and then sat down in the evenings and read Whitman aloud with complete unself-consciousness. He had told her once, in bed in the winter dark, that he thought she was the most capable person he had ever known. She had said, "What about James Sixskiller?" He had said, "James Sixskiller and you are tied." She had laughed against his shoulder and said she was satisfied with that. In the spring of 1882, Thomas came in from the south pasture one afternoon and told his father there were two men looking at the fence line on the property's south edge, which was the edge that bordered a strip of land currently under dispute between the Fletcher property and the large cattle operation owned by a man named Harlan Pruitt, who had acquired several adjacent parcels in the previous year and had developed the habit of assuming that property lines were more suggestion than law. Stephen rode out to the fence line. Augusta, who had come to the porch when she heard the exchange, watched him go with the flat, contained expression of a woman who has been following the Pruitt situation for months and does not like where it is going. He came back an hour later and sat down at the kitchen table with the look of a man who has just had a firm and unpleasant conversation. "Pruitt's men are claiming the south fence is 12 yards inside their property," he said. "Based on what?" Augusta said, sitting across from him. "Based on a survey they commissioned from a man in Ellsworth who I suspect is being paid to find a particular answer." Augusta was quiet for a moment. "What does the original deed say?" "The creek bank, which puts our fence where it belongs. Then we go to the county assessor and we bring the deed and we bring James if he will come, because he has been on this land longer than any white settler including Pruitt and he knows the creek's course." Stephen looked at her. "Do not give an inch," she said. "Not a single inch." They did not. The county assessor's review in June, conducted with the original Garfield deed and the testimony of James Sixskiller about the creek's historical course, and two neighboring property owners who confirmed the fence line's long-standing position, found in the Fletcher property's favor with the kind of finality that tends to end such disputes definitively. Pruitt's men removed themselves from the vicinity of the south fence and did not return. James Sixskiller, riding home after the assessor's ruling, stopped by the Fletcher property and accepted a cup of coffee on the new porch and said, in his understated way, that it was good when things were resolved as they ought to be. Stephen agreed. Augusta poured more coffee. The summer of 1882 was gentle compared to the previous summer's storms, warm and steady, the rains coming at reasonable intervals, the grass lush and the cattle fat and contented. The kitchen garden produced more than Augusta had planned for, and she spent several mornings canning and preserving while the boys ran loose in the property's safe perimeter, with the freedom of children who have been trusted with reasonable latitude and have earned it. Thomas, at 9, discovered that he had a natural gift for breaking horses, in the patient, communication-based manner of someone who understands the animal's perspective, which was very much the way his father worked. He spent the summer with a young bay gelding that had been purchased from a trader and needed gentling, and by August the horse was ready to work, and Thomas had a look of satisfaction about him that Augusta recognized as a Fletcher family expression, the look of a person who has done something real and knows it. Robert, at 3, continued drawing with such absorption that they occasionally had to remind him to eat. It was Thomas who found the injured hawk in the north pasture in September, a red tail that had come down hard from something and was sitting on the ground unable to fly. He came to get his mother because his instinct was right that this required an adult. Augusta went out to look at the bird, which was injured in one wing but alert and very clear about its feelings regarding being approached by humans. She and Thomas spent an hour working out how to move it to safety without causing further injury, using a canvas grain sack and a great deal of patient waiting, and got it settled in the linta with water and what they could manage for food. The hawk stayed 3 weeks, during which Robert drew it approximately 40 times from every angle while maintaining what was for a 3-year-old a remarkable respectful distance. And then one morning it was simply gone, the lean-to empty, the window they had left cracked for this exact purpose standing open. Thomas stood in the empty lean-to looking up at the window with a complicated expression. "It was supposed to go," Augusta told him. "I know," he said. "Things that are meant to be free should be free," she said. He thought about this. "Is that always true? For birds," she said, "and for people." He considered this with the serious attention he brought to things his mother said. "Then what about cattle?" "Cattle," she said, "are a somewhat different case." He smiled, which was a good smile, the wide, unguarded version that reminded her so strongly of his father that it sometimes stopped her breath. Stephen had been watching from the door of the lean-to. When Augusta turned and found him there, she saw the same smile on his face, the original version, and she understood that this was what a life built right looked like. These mornings and these conversations and this complicated, beloved boy asking reasonable questions about the nature of freedom and the categorical distinction of cattle. The winter of 1883 was the winter that Ruth's husband Henry fell ill with a lung sickness that the Abilene doctor named and could not cure. Ruth wrote to Augusta in November, and Augusta packed a bag and was in Abilene within 2 days, leaving Stephen to manage the property and the boys with Clara Sixkeler's help. She stayed with Ruth through the worst of it, the long weeks of the worst illness, sitting with Henry through the difficult nights, managing the household while Ruth sat with her husband, being steady in the particular way that close family is steady when everything else is uncertain. Henry Malone died in January of 1883, quietly, in his own bed, with Ruth holding his hand. He was 62 years old and he had been a good and decent man, and his death left a real absence in the world that a person like Augusta, who measured people by their quality rather than their prominence, felt fully. She stayed with Ruth for 6 weeks. Stephen came to Abilene twice during that time, for the funeral and again 3 weeks later, and each time he arrived at Ruth's door, he had the quality of a man who understood exactly what was needed, which was practical help and reliable presence, and no requirements placed on anyone's grief. He fixed the broken fence around Henry's merchant yard, cleared the dead winter garden, arranged with a neighbor to keep an eye on the property, and spoke to Ruth with the same steady directness he brought to Augusta, which was what Ruth needed from someone who was not family by blood, but had been becoming family by everything else for 8 years. When Augusta finally came home in early March, riding the familiar road from Abilene to Ellsworth in the early spring light, she came into the yard to find Thomas at the water trough with the horses, and Robert on the porch with his sketchbook, and Stephen coming out of the barn with his sleeves rolled up, and the look of a man who had been managing things in the efficient, unhurried way of someone who is entirely capable alone, but prefers not to be. He came across the yard to her and helped her down from Pepper, who was now 11 years old and had developed extremely firm opinions about her routine, and he held her for a moment in the yard, neither of them saying anything, the early March light thin and clear around them, the boys watching from their various positions with the attentiveness of children who understand that something important is happening even if they cannot precisely name it. "Ruth?" he asked. "She will manage," Augusta said against his shoulder. "She is that kind of woman." "I know," he said. "You are that kind too." She pulled back and looked at him. His face was what it had always been, the clean-lined, honest face of a man she had married in a Presbyterian church in the middle of February 8 years prior, because he had given her his last match in a storm and told her he had found his warmth, and because she had recognized, in those 5 hours of shared crisis, something in him that she had been looking for without knowing she was looking. "I am very glad to be home," she said. "This place has been waiting for you," he said. Ruth did manage, as Augusta had known she would. She sold the merchant store to a reliable buyer by summer and made the decision, with the deliberate courage of a woman in her mid-40s who has always been capable of courage, to come to Ellsworth County. There was a small house available in Ellsworth itself, near the main street, solid and manageable, and Ruth purchased it outright with the proceeds of the sale and moved in by fall. She was within an hour's ride of the Fletcher property. Sunday dinners at the Fletcher house became a regular institution that included Ruth and James and Clara and their children, and occasionally Thomas Reardon, who had returned to the county after several years away and was running his own small operation 7 miles south. The table was, on these Sundays, a very full and various and good thing. Augusta's dressmaking continued to grow. By 1884, she had more work than she could properly manage alone and trained a young woman named Pearl Donner, 17 and extraordinarily precise with a needle, as an assistant, which solved the volume problem and also provided Pearl with a skill and an income that she had not had before, which was something Augusta considered part of the work's value. She thought sometimes about the women who had no such paths, no skill to sell, no cousin with a spare room, and she talked to the minister's wife in Ellsworth about the idea of a sewing circle that would also teach practical dressmaking skills to women who needed them, something with actual instruction rather than just social stitching. And by the spring of 1885, this had become a real thing that met on Tuesday afternoons in the church hall. Stephen had said when she first described the idea to him, "How much do you need to start it?" she had told him. He had gotten up from the kitchen table and gone to the cash box on the shelf and taken out the amount and put it on the table and sat back down and picked up his book. She had looked at the money and then at him. "Stephen Fletcher," she said. "Augusta Fletcher," he said, not looking up from the page. "You are impossible," she said. "I prefer possible," he said. "I find the sewing circle an extremely sensible idea and I trust you entirely to run it well." She looked at the money on the table between them. "I was going to budget for it from the dressmaking receipts gradually. You were going to be modest about it," he said. "This is faster." She took the money. The sewing circle met for the first time on a Tuesday in April 1885 with 11 women present, ranging in age from 16 to 58, and by fall it had grown to 19, and 3 of those women had used the skills to generate their own income by the following year. Augusta tracked this with the satisfaction of someone who understands that practical good compounds. Thomas Fletcher, at 12, was riding fence alone and managing the south pasture cattle with the competence of someone considerably older. Stephen had begun discussing with Augusta, in the quiet evenings after the boys were asleep, what Thomas's future might look like, whether the land they had built would be enough for both boys or whether they needed to think about acquiring more. It was the kind of conversation that had real stakes and they brought their full attention to it. Robert, at 7, had discovered, in addition to drawing, that he had a remarkable ear for music. A traveling trader had left a battered harmonica at the Sixkiller property in payment for a night's board, and James had given it to Robert, who had worked out, entirely on his own in the space of 1 week, how to produce actual coherent music from it. He played in the evenings on the porch, the thin, reedy sound of it carrying out over the Kansas dusk, and it was one of the sounds that Augusta knew she would carry with her long after, the specific texture of a specific time, her younger son making music on the porch as the light went dark across the prairie. They bought another 15 acres in 1885, on the north side of the original property, which brought the Fletcher holding to 70 acres total. It was enough, Stephen calculated, with proper management, to sustain 2 operations eventually, which was what he had been thinking about when he talked to Augusta in those evening conversations about their sons' futures. The spring of 1887 arrived with a particular sweetness after a mild winter, the creek running clean and the wildflowers coming up in the pasture, in profusions of blue and yellow, that Robert spent 3 days drawing, and Thomas spent approximately 45 seconds observing before returning to the horses. Augusta walked the property on a mid-April morning alone, while Stephen was at the south fence and the boys were at their Saturday lessons in the Ellsworth schoolhouse, and she walked all the way around the perimeter, 70 acres, the full circuit, in the growing morning light. She walked past the line of cottonwoods along the creek, past the place where the south fence met James Sixkiller's property, past the north field where the new grass was coming in thick and green, past the big hay barn with its properly repaired roof, past the kitchen garden's winter-turned beds waiting for planting, past the back of the house where the wood pile was stacked precisely against the wall, and around to the front where the wide porch waited in the morning sun, the two rocking chairs side by side. The house solid behind them on its Kansas foundation. She stood in the yard and looked at it all. 13 years earlier, she had been standing in a rainstorm beside a broken wagon over a dead horse with a flint and no steel in the dark ahead. She had been 26 and alone, and frightened in a way she had not admitted to anyone, not then and not since, because the fear had been the kind that does not help anything if expressed. She was 39 years old now. She had a husband who was the truest person she had ever known, 2 sons who were extraordinary in entirely different ways, 70 acres of Kansas land that she understood in her bones by now, a dressmaking business that had grown beyond what she had imagined, a sewing circle that was doing real good, a cousin who was an hour's ride away and came to Sunday dinners, a friend in James Sixkiller who made them all better simply by being what he was. She had built this. They had built this. From a last match in a storm, and 4 words that still, 13 years later, moved through her chest like warm water. Stephen came around from the south fence line on the sorrel, an older sorrel now, and pulled up when he saw her standing in the yard and swung down and walked to her, already reading the expression on her face with the completeness of a man who has been reading that face for 13 years. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About a storm," she said. "Which one?" "The first one." He stood beside her and looked at the house and the land, following her sight line, taking it in with her. "I think about it too," he said. "Often. What do you think about when you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment, the particular considered quiet that was one of her most beloved things about him, the refusal to answer quickly when a real answer required thought. "I think about how close it was," he said. "How many things had to happen in a particular way, the storm arriving when it did, the wheel breaking there and not elsewhere, my fence line inspection running long." "1 match left," she said. "1 match left," he agreed. She turned to look at him. He turned to look at her. They had been looking at each other for 13 years and it had not become ordinary. She thought it probably would not. "I would do it all again," she said. "Every mile of that road. Every mile of Missouri and the farm lost and the ride to Abilene. I would do it all again to get to that storm." He reached out and touched her face the way he had on their first anniversary, his thumb at her cheekbone, his hand steady and warm. "So would I," he said, "although I would find you some dry tinder so you did not have to worry about the match." She laughed, and the Kansas morning light was on the both of them, on the house and the land and the wide porch with its 2 rocking chairs, and there was no version of the word warmth that did not already live in it. That Sunday, Ruth came for dinner and James and Clara came with their children, and Thomas Reardon came from his place south of the creek, and Pearl Donner came with her new husband, a quiet young farmer she had married in the fall who looked at her with the particular attention of a person entirely surprised by their own good fortune. The kitchen table was extended to its fullest length, and still the company sat close, and the noise of it was considerable, everyone talking at once in the overlapping way of people who are genuinely glad to be in the same room. Robert played the harmonica on the porch after supper while the children ran in the yard, and the adults sat in the Sunday evening warmth of a life that had been built well and on purpose. Thomas sat beside his father on the porch steps, the original insufficient steps that had never been replaced, because some things earn their keeping just by being what they are, and Stephen had his arm around the boy in the easy, comfortable way of a father who likes his son. Augusta sat in one of the rocking chairs with her coffee and watched all of it. Ruth sat in the other rocking chair and said nothing for a while, which was unusual enough that Augusta noticed. Then Ruth said, "I think about that letter I wrote you in February of '74, whether you would come or not." "What made you write it?" Augusta asked. "I had a feeling," Ruth said, "that you needed to come west, that there was something here for you." "Did you know about Stephen Fletcher?" "I did not know about anyone named Stephen Fletcher," Ruth said, "but I had a feeling." Augusta rocked gently. The evening air was warm and the sky above the Kansas plain was going its extravagant colors. Robert's harmonica played something slow and true. "Thank you," Augusta said, "for the letter." "Thank you for coming," Ruth said. Augusta looked at the yard, at her sons, at her husband on the step with Thomas, at James Sixkiller telling a story to whoever would listen with the economical precision of a good storyteller, at the whole good thing laid out in the evening light. Her father's Bible was on the shelf inside. Her cousin was in the next chair. The land was hers and real and earned. Her boys would grow into men on it, would take different roads from it. Thomas to the land itself, most likely, and Robert to wherever his art and music took him. And both roads were good roads. There would be more years and more seasons and more storms and more mornings that were clean and cold and entirely worth waking up for. And across the yard, Stephen Fletcher looked up from the porch step and found her eyes, the way he always did, as though he always knew precisely where she was. And something passed between them in that look that required no translation and no intermediary, only the long knowledge of two people who had been paying attention to each other for 13 years and intended to continue for whatever years remained. She raised her coffee cup in a small, private acknowledgement. He nodded once, in the slow way. The harmonica played. The children ran in the yard. The Kansas evening went on doing its beautiful and indifferent work. And on the wide porch of a house built from a last match and 4 true words, Augusta Kendrick Fletcher rocked and breathed and was, in the fullest and most complete sense of the word, exactly where she was supposed to be.